Definitely can taste the rainbow. Well, good morning and welcome back to the Cottage Farmstead Kitchen. I'm Rebecca. Farmer Nathan is off at the farmer's market this morning selling a whole bunch of vegetables. So I'm here in the kitchen making our lunch for the coming week. And this time of year we have a whole bunch of tomatoes and green beans and peppers and a whole bunch of things coming out of the garden, and we're just trying to find different ways to use it. So one of the things that we do when we're meal planning is to go through some of our cookbooks and pick recipes that use a lot of the ingredients that we have coming out of our garden. So we kind of reverse it. We don't look at the cookbook and then pick a recipe. We look at what food we have and then find a recipe that has those items in it. So I thought I'd take you along and show you one of our favorite summer soup recipes. So I discovered this cookbook, I believe, at the local library, and then either myself or someone else got this cookbook for me around my birthday last year. And it's mostly vegetarian based, but it had a lot of good recipes for cooking with the seasons. And one that I'm working on today, as I mentioned, was the summer minestrone soup. And what she does in here is she'll have minestrone 3 different ways. And so she'll have a spring version, a summer version, and a fall version based on what's coming out of the garden. And so, I mean, I've made some of my modifications. As you can see, I have notes. It's typically what happens when I make a recipe, make it to our taste. But the gist of it is this is the recipe that I'm working off of today. I got the onions and carrots started before I turned on the camera. The onions that we have from our garden this year are extra watery, so they take a lot longer to cook down and start caramelizing, so I got them started before I turned on the camera. So the original recipe calls for 100 grams of green beans, and since I'm sort of doubling the recipe, I am going to do approximately 200 grams of green beans. I might do a little bit more because I really like green beans. It's one of those recipes that's really forgiving of what vegetables you put in. You can kind of mix and match. Like we probably mentioned in another video, we weren't super impressed with the old homestead variety, which is this green bean. They're kind of tough, even though we harvested them at not a terrible size. And they just didn't produce very well, so we're probably not going to grow that pole bean next year. But we still love our purple potted beans. So next up, the recipe calls for 2 bell peppers. Right now, our violet sparkler peppers are producing. As you can see, they're a lot smaller than a bell pepper. So I got a second from Growing Green Family Farms that's a little soft in a few places. I wasn't sure I was going to have quite enough bell peppers, so I did grab 1 extra bell pepper from the grocery store to supplement. So my favorite way to cut peppers, that works especially well on bell peppers, is to avoid cutting the seeds. So you leave the seeds attached to the pepper and then you don't have to worry about them getting everywhere, especially if you're doing like a hot pepper, you don't want the seeds in a dish. So what you do is you cut shoulder to shoulder, and that allows you to avoid cutting the seed chamber. And you might have to come back and get a few slivers off the side. But for me, it's worth it to not have to deal with seeds in my dish. And see, there you have it. All the seeds stayed right in the center. And I can come back and cut off a little bit of this if I want to, or I'd usually just feed it to the chickens. So chickens absolutely love pepper seeds. Then we need 2 pounds of diced tomatoes, some of the ones from our garden. that we didn't use for tomato sauce earlier this week. So they'll have a little bit more blemishes on them that'll take a little bit longer to chop, but still be delicious in a soup.
Sometimes you can just modulate your soil mix a little bit, like maybe add a little more coconut coir or something like that, a little more water. I think something that a lot of people don't do, Melissa, which I'm not sure why, is we mulch maybe on our in-ground plantings or our raised beds. We don't mulch our containers. Still mulch your containers. That helps quite a bit. And then you can set it up on irrigation. You can throw a saucer at the bottom, fill that up with water as sort of like a nice little buffer. There's a lot of things you can do to mitigate the fact that typically in grow bags.
So I just realized that I don't have as much broth as I thought I did in the freezer, so I'm gonna have to improvise a little bit to get enough broth. And that's where my bouillon spice comes at hand. Since I have food sensitivities to glutamate, I cannot eat any broth pretty much that's been made in a store. So I have to do it all from scratch, make it myself. And so when I come into these pinches, I have a spice recipe that does not involve any sort of MSG, any yeast extract, any meat flavoring. This is pretty much like a vegetarian broth powder that I put together with stuff that's just in the cabinet, and I'll link to that recipe for this that I found online below. In our humid house, it gets a bit caked up, so I have to work on getting it out of here entirely. But it'll help me flavor another 4 cups of water into broth. Now that the onions and carrots are done, it calls for garlic, so I'm just gonna do 6 just scoops. I think it's 6 cloves, but we like things on the garlicier side. I'll do a good handful of scoops in there. Next recipe calls for celery stalks. One of the inconveniences of not having my primary growing garden in the backyard is that I don't always have stuff I can just go harvest right away. We dry celery leaves so that we can have a ready supply of celery flavor on hand without having to drive 10 minutes away to harvest the celery stalk for a recipe. Look at that beautiful bowl of vegetables. I put the green beans, the peppers, and the tomatoes in there as I chopped them up and weighed them on the scale. And now I'll be dumping them in and letting them roast for about 5 minutes in the pan before I add the broth. I always love seeing all the colors that come out of the garden in the summer. Definitely can taste the rainbow way better than Skittles this way. The original recipe called for only 7 grams of fresh basil, which I'm not sure why. So we're gonna like quadruple the amount of basil that goes into this recipe because we really love enjoying the fresh flavor of basil this time of year. I forgot to thaw our broth overnight, so it's still a little bit frozen in there. I'll have to zap it a little bit longer, but I got the basil in there. I'll probably be tossing in a bay leaf because I have a note that we liked it better that way last time. But after I get the broth in there, we'll let it simmer. Then we'll add the chickpeas, and then the final ingredient is, instead of doing noodles, to make this gluten-free, we're going to use Zoodles, zucchini noodles. While this tool is not 100% necessary, and yes, it does take up a lot of cabinet space, it does wonders in making noodles out of zucchini, which is one of our favorite ways to use zucchini in the summer in soups, is spiralizing them and dumping in the soups, and it has a nice crunch to it. Since I can't eat gluten, it's a great way to have a noodle type texture in my soup. You could use your knife and slice them really thin, like matchstick style, mimicking spaghetti, but this just makes it a whole lot easier. One of the things that I like about this recipe, instead of using regular beans, it uses chickpeas. I love chickpeas. Typically, we buy chickpeas in bulk, dried, and then we make our own, but we have not been able to find dried chickpeas at the grocery stores around us in a while, so I've been buying the cans as needed. So after the soup has simmered for 10 minutes, that's when you'll add the already cooked chickpeas in. It's also when you'll add your zucchini noodles. Zucchini noodles, if you cook them too long, they become mush. So you want to have your soup cooked, and then you turn off the heat, dump in your noodles and stir them a little bit, and they'll cook just enough to be a little bit crisp without becoming mush in your soup. Give this a stir in here, and then I'll let it cool down before I stick it in the refrigerator for the coming week. Well, hope you enjoyed making some summer minestrone soup with me in the kitchen this morning. I'll link below to the cookbook that this recipe came from and was inspired by, so that you can check it out for yourself. I'll also link to a playlist of some of our other videos where we're cooking from scratch in the kitchen. Happy growing and cooking, friends. Catch you next time.